Keep talking and get to Dan McGroarty. He is president of U.S. Rare Earths. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. And still with us as our guest host, Michael Yoshikami from YCMNET Advisors, around the desk with us here at the SGX. Dan, good to see you. This is perhaps one of Washington's most critical and important bilateral relationships with China. Economics, defense, the strategic relationship. You are focused much more, though, on what they're doing or what they're going to be talking about in terms of rare earths. Talk to us about that.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, absolutely. When you look at some of the issues that we know are in the headlines of this meeting of the G2, if you want to look at it that way, technology development, trade, competitiveness, manufacturing, I think the sleeper issue underneath all of these is metals access, rare earths in particular, but many other metals as well, because without those raw materials feeding in, neither country can be as competitive as it needs to be. So the metals issue, the rare earths issue in particular, is one that I'll be watching closely to see whether whether that rises up in the bilateral discussion.
Yeah, Michael Yoshikami, even before we get to exotic stuff like rare earths, you're more concerned with more mundane stuff like copper.
Yeah, you know, copper really is, generally speaking, considered an indication of a health of an economy. Yeah. Increased demand tends to suggest there's telecommunications build out, there's just increased economic activity. The question I have for Dan, and I know he feels the same way, that copper is a very, very important metal to watch. It might not be necessarily a rare metal, but what suggests to you that the demand that we're seeing out of China right now is actually real demand, as opposed to buying copper at a low price and storing copper?
Hoarding, in other words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a key issue in terms of whether or not you're seeing actual demand that feeds into the manufacturing cycle, or whether you're seeing people stockpile at low rates, you know, for use at a future point in time. That's difficult to separate out. But I want to say, just over time, when you look at something like copper, which is considered a mainstay metal, but is actually in quite high demand for tech applications, and will be increasingly so. And you look at things like the general movement of 2 to 2.5 billion people in China, in India, over the course of the next decade plus, into a middle-class existence, the consumer pressure that that's going to create, the manufacturing needs that that's going to create. I think we're going to see an increased demand for copper that's durable and enduring, and I think the same for other metals as well. And I think we're also going to have to start paying more attention to old uses of these metals and the new tech uses on the other side as well. Copper and the rare earths, for instance, both being used in the measure of tonnage in each individual wind turbine. You know, we're focused on wind energy. These are key metals.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, though, Dan, you know, we've been watching China for a number of years now as it sort of goes out in the world and tries to secure supply chain to feed an economy that's still growing in excess of 8, 9, 10% a year. We've been mostly focused on oil, the African continent, et cetera, but, you know, over commodities, over things like even copper, how high is the likelihood that these two giants could end up butting heads?
Well, that's a very good question and a very real concern, and I think it does come up. You're looking at what is the internal Chinese demand at a growth rate of 8%, 9%, or a cooling rate 6% to 7%. It's still enormous, and the Chinese will be net users of enormous amounts of these raw materials feeding into their manufacturing base and system. Then you overlay the geopolitics of it, whether it's copper, whether it's rare earths, and whether or not the Chinese will be feeding the usage in other countries in the world, particularly, as I would say, in the U.S., where the U.S., and my company's involved here, has not been doing what it can to develop its own domestic resources, these metals, to contribute a supply to meet this increased demand. So it's really tough if we start to push China to export more, when in fact we haven't done what we can to add to the supply side of this equation.
That's an excellent point, Dan. China does account for 97% of the world's rare earths, but other countries haven't really tried to develop their rare earths and get them out of the ground. Are there any opportunities there for investors, do you think?
I think there are, and I think this is one of the interesting instances where you're looking at information about technology and technology needs for these, some people call these tech metals. You know, when they're used in our cell phones, for the vibration function in our cell phones when they're used in wind turbines, to the tune of 1 ton of neodymium, one of the rare earths, in each wind turbine when they're used in Tomahawk cruise missiles and defense applications. We're globally going to be using and needing a lot of these metals in the future. The Chinese have been mining them. Because they're providing 97% of the rare earths, doesn't mean they control 97%. The United States, the projects we're looking at developing, give great potential. Australians, Canadians, other places around the world are blessed with these resources. The question is whether they're going to get them out of the ground and into the manufacturing economy.
All right, thank you so much for joining us and for telling us about the story, Dan. That was Dan McGroarty of U.S. Rare Earths, and we've got more to come with Michael Yoshikami of YCMNET Advisors. Do email in your questions.